Once upon a time, when America was young, there was a great need for land to be occupied, for industries to be established, and for infrastructure to be built. Today, we experience the echoes of that legacy, a nation that was built by the blood, sweat, and tears of immigrants, slaves, and indentured servants. A nation that was built on land taken from native peoples who had called this place home for millennia. In the next several episodes, we will look at some of the pivotal moments by which we have come to today's political push and pull between factions about what constitutes merit and worthiness, of the importance of entry, residency, and citizenship in today's cultural dialogue. 14 years after the formation of the United States of America, on July 4, 1776, the eligibility for citizenship by naturalization and the pathways by which immigrants could become U.S. citizens were defined. Initially, these rights were limited to free white persons. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. It authorized the confiscation of land from Native Americans and provided resources for their forced removal west of the Mississippi River. Following the Mexican-American War, the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo formalized the United States' annexation of a major portion of northern Mexico, granting citizenship to Mexicans who remained on the annexed land. During this first century of development and expansion, the country was moving ever closer to the bloodiest conflict in American history. Did Americans realize at the time that they were on the brink of the bloodiest war the country would experience in all of its history? In 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sanford legal ruling established that slaves and free African Americans were not citizens of the U.S. and were not entitled to the rights and privileges of citizenship. The divisive power of that decision fed America's descent into the chaos and tragedy of civil war. As the war drew to a close, in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, ordering the freedom of all slaves in states under Confederate rule. With the deaths of over 620,000 people and the destruction of uncounted lives and property, the American Civil War finally came to an end. 3 years later, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, providing rights to African Americans and guaranteed birthright citizenship for all persons born in the United States, as well as equal protections and due process for all legal residents. In 1870, rights of naturalized citizenship were expanded to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, but were denied to other non-white immigrant groups. And in 1875, a Supreme Court decision affirmed that the federal government holds sole authority to regulate immigration. That is what the federal government proceeded to do. In its first century, the United States of America grew through the appropriation and acquisition of land, and through the immigration of new citizens, primarily Europeans. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, African-origin immigrants and formerly enslaved African Americans gained citizenship and the right to protection under the law. Up to 1882, nearly everyone coming into the country was allowed to enter and stay. Two notable European groups had benefited from the policies at that time: Irish and German immigrants. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland had experienced a period of hard times, known to them as Andraschiel, because of a lack of diversity in Ireland's potato crops, with all the plants stemming from the same genetic source. There was an inability to fend off a strain of blight, the fungus Phytophthora infestans. The disease turns the leaves of potato plants black, and the potatoes rot in a matter of days. About 1 million Irish died of starvation and disease. Another million fled the famine to take up residence in America. The extreme hardship and famine for many Irish citizens that followed the loss of what had been their primary food source left them with few choices for survival. About 1 million Irish died, and another million fled to America in the wake of the potato famine in the mid-19th century. In the same time period, many Germans found themselves fleeing persecution when right-wing monarchists overthrew the newly formed German parliament. These immigrants were known as the German 48ers. In both the Irish and German cases, the United States' acceptance of people in need turned out to be immensely valuable to the country's economic and political growth. For these cases, and for many others, we might not be far off the mark to say that America is as much a land of refugees as a land of immigrants, as much a place of refuge as a place of opportunity. In 1882, America's first policy to formally exclude a people by race was put into effect. The Chinese exclusion law wasn't repealed until 1943. That law was followed a few months later by the Immigration Act of 1882, which expanded the ranks of excludable aliens to include other undesirable persons and attributes, such as convicts, lunatics, and those likely to become a public charge. But what does it mean to be a public charge? The Immigration Act of 1882 was the first law to regulate immigration at the federal level. With it came the concept of a public charge. The idea was that the public has an obligation to care for persons who cannot provide their own way, and thereby become a burden on public resources. If the care of such a person was expected to result in a net cost to the public, the government should deny them entry to the country or should deport them. Despite the severity of the policy, the vast majority of people who arrived at a port of entry were allowed to enter. The Immigration Service excluded only 1% of the 25 million immigrants from Europe who arrived at Ellis Island between 1880 and World War I. Before World War I, we had virtually open borders. You didn't need a passport. You didn't need a visa. There was no such thing as a green card. If you showed up at Ellis Island, walked without a limp, had money in your pocket, and passed a very simple IQ test in your own language, you were admitted, said Maine Guy, a professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University. In the early 20th century, as the nation matured, so did the focus of attention on those newly arriving on our shores. The needs of the nation were becoming more specific. There was a shift in interest from come one, come all to need fulfillment. Attention was focused on labor, skills, and investment. What had been a promised land of refuge and opportunity for all was becoming a workplace for those with skills or money. Following World War I, a need had emerged to manage the influx of population. The Quota Law of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 created a quota system that was based on race and nationality. The quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 National Census. It completely excluded immigrants from Asia. Calvin Coolidge signed the 1924 Immigration Act in part based on the alignment of Western European countries' demographics with his beliefs in eugenics and racial superiority. As laws were passed to keep out Asians and Eastern and Southern Europeans, immigrants from those countries, as well as others who could not pass literacy tests, pay the head tax, or enter through the quota system, began to enter outside of the legal system. With every added restrictive and exclusionary practice, there was a rise in unauthorized immigration. The quota system and its discretionary approach to deportation of those with meritorious cases remained largely unchanged from the early 1920s through 1965. In 1945, a directive from the Truman administration used the quota system to support European refugees fleeing the aftermath of World War II. President Truman said of the policy, "Common decency and the fundamental comradeship of all human beings require it." This was the start of the slow opening of borders to refugees through various acts issued into the early 1950s. Among the beneficiaries of those acts were people fleeing the spread of communism, such as Hungarians in 1956 and Cubans after the victory of Fidel Castro in 1959. Two prominent figures that are a product of that refugee program are Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. In 1965, the long-standing quota system was replaced with a new framework, which is still in use today.